Hello, this talk was given as part of a workshop for the Kesho project recently in 2024. I hope you enjoy.
So today, as we did mention, we are going into the Kesho Toolkit itself, the application of the tool and how we deploy it out in the field and what processes or stages we need to go through. You need to leave this place knowing that if you want to use the Kesho Toolkit, there are 4 steps to think through. Step 1, we talked about the pre-workshop scoping and stakeholder mapping. That is the stage at which you set yourself out. In other words, that first section is basically you are scoping, you are setting yourself out to do a work. So if you are going to ask for money from your finance officer, you will need to know, why are you asking me for money? How much do you want? Where are you going to spend this money? How long is it going to take? That is what happens in the pre-workshop scoping and stakeholder mapping stage, because that's what's going to determine how much resources you are going to use. Then scenario boundary setting. You've now decided this is where you want to do it, but now you can't do it across the entire country, for example. Where do I start? Where do I end? So you start to set the boundary based on your mapping. You've seen all my stakeholders are based in Nairobi, and therefore I don't need to go to Narok, I don't need to go to Mombasa. I'll finish my work within Nairobi. Or they are spread all over the place. So how do I get them? Where do I go to get all these people? So you set your boundaries. So when you're done with that, then now you go into the workshop proper, which is the 3rd stage. You are now leaving your office and going to the workshop proper to generate data. In normal research, you say now you're going for field work, to go and collect your data for whatever period of time. In this case, now you go for the workshop itself, and the objective now is to develop the scenarios. Because remember, we said they are participatory scenario development. So you now don't sit in the office and start thinking about what happened in 2020, how things changed, when did this policy come into being. But you go out there with the stakeholders and now work with them to generate some of those historical timelines. We'll see those ones, to generate some of those narratives. They now help you answer those questions. Then from there, you come back to your office. You've collected your data in the normal research now. You're back to the office. You start now your data cleaning, understanding what this data is all about, corroborating, collecting secondary data, adding onto this one to make sense of it. So the analysis process is now for us the modeling process. You now input your data into whatever system you are using, whether it is ArcGIS, IDRIS, or whatever it is, to now come up with your results. At the end of the day, you now do your final thing here, which is the scenario mapping, the map that shows the scenarios that you've produced. Then, in this case, now we are saying it is not final. Because you collected this information from people and you want them to be the consumers of the information, you must take it back to them to confirm that it is the true reflection of what they had in mind, the validation process. Are we clear? So you must understand it from the beginning. You start alone, you finish with them. The key ones are here, the key steps, because this one is just the validation, which in normal research we say, mtu huyu alikuja amesanya data kwetu tumempatia information and then ametoroka nayo. So what we are doing is, we don't want kuambiwa ati tulitoroka na information. We have to bring it back to them. But the key stages are these 4 ones, because this is where the real work happens. This is just to confirm whether it is true or false. In the discussion, let's keep in our mind that the Kesho tool is a framework. So that framework just guides you on where you start your process and where you end. So there's no place you'll say you need to input some data into the framework and get the results. The pre-workshop step is very critical. And the beauty of it is that it begins with creating those relationships, identifying the key stakeholders that you want to engage with, because they are the ones who will give you the kind of data that you want. And so we have to think about how to get these people on board. And I'll give you the very simple one that we've done here to bring us to this workshop. We started by making a phone call to an individual friend, who then referred to another friend, and then a short meeting of 3 people took place, and then it metamorphed into an institutional conversation, and eventually we are here for a workshop. So how you build relationships vary. It depends on your personal choices. You have to sequence those relationships. It is difficult to just send anonymous invitations and expect people to respond. Many people would want to respond if there is that personal interaction. If you wanted to bring community members on board, then there is a way you have to approach that community. In most cases, we've got the people we call the gatekeepers in communities. You want to go do research, you want to initiate a project, you go there and people are just adamant. They're not responding, they're not coming to meetings. But if one of those people they trust in the community says, guys, we want you for a meeting, the entire village comes on board. So how do you break those kinds of barriers? You have to learn whom to talk to get you to the next level. And that is quite critical because that is what will help us to prioritize the people you want to bring on board. Again, like we said yesterday, you don't want to bring people just for the sake of it. You want to bring the relevant people who will give you the relevant information to make that process successful. Social network mapping. I meet you and I share with you an idea and say, by the way, I think I know somebody who has done a similar work. I'll send an email to introduce the two of you. Then you are able to get the right people who can then, or the right institutions who can then join you in that process. Negotiating power dynamics. Again, that's quite interesting. You must understand that nobody would want to be seen to be weak. No institution would want to be seen to be subservient to the other. So how do you negotiate those kind of power dynamics? How do you ensure that your partners or stakeholders don't feel like there's one superior stakeholder in the group? We are all equal. We are starting on equal footing. Let's say, for example, you are working on a forest project. Within this community forest, we've got, I don't know if they still use them, the community forest associations, yeah? The CFAs. In reality, they should hold a lot of power because they are the main custodians of the forest. But by law, KFS plays a bigger role. And in terms of research, KEFRI provides more research capacity. But guess what? When they hold meetings, you might find that in a meeting somewhere there, a CFA chairman becomes the chair of that meeting. Not that KEFRI feels that, why am I not the one chairing? But you understand that for you to get something out of that local forest association, you need to give them the power to make those kinds of decisions, but you provide the oversight in a way that they don't feel being guided into a certain direction. That way they will participate for the longer term, as opposed to just coming because they have been summoned into a meeting. So understanding those dynamics will really help us identify which stakeholders to bring on board. Again, from historical interactions, you will be able to understand that some institutions have always appeared to dominate the conversations. And therefore, when you bring others on board with them, you risk the chance of others walking out because they are not happy based on their previous interactions. And that's where this first stage shuttle diplomacy is quite important. When I met you and we talked about my interest, you said we can bring ACC, we can bring IUCN, KEFRI, KFS, KWS, and the rest. But be careful about the relationship between KEFRI and KFS. They have had a little bit, frosty relationships. But because I want to be a neutral player and I want all of them on board, I then have to go in and ask a few questions and find the best representatives who might not represent those institutional, funny relationships. So at the end of the day, we still work together, but we try to, downplay some of those disagreements. And that can help us still negotiate for those power dynamics. And you find people seeing you working with all of them, and yet they cannot work amongst themselves. Some of the key questions to ask, particularly if you are determining the engagement process. Number one is which categories of stakeholders need to be included, depending on your objective there. If you're working on water resources, I don't think it will be necessary to identify a stakeholder that have got no interest, no idea, no capacity or whatever to deal with water projects. So who are the people to come on board and where are they based? Because that will determine how much money and how much time I'll spend to go and reach out to them. Are they within my vicinity, or I have to go out of the county to look for them? And what are the engagement transaction costs? Some of them are good enough to join you, but it might be overly expensive to bring them on board. Again, the timelines. How often do you want to engage them? Do you want a team that you meet every week, monthly, yearly, or quarterly? All those are critical things to think through, and also in what format. Is it going to be online, face-to-face, workshops like this, phone calls, and what have you? They all go into those considerations, and therefore they will help you to deal with that. And that brings you into how you can then categorize them. So who is the organizing group? So this could be a small core group, you want to build a plan, or participating in a group that has got a broader mix of people. So think through, again, that will be driven by the data needs. If I need a lot of data from different people, then I have to mix. If it's just data from small groups, maybe it is just, I'm targeting just a women group. So I don't need to bring a big group of so many people with different interests. I just focus on a small team of women group. We discuss projects on the ground, and we are done with that. Again, we will take ownership for the implementation of this outcome. Like we said yesterday, you are not running the workshop just for the sake of it. And based on that transdisciplinarity we discussed, you are co-producing solutions. When I co-produce solutions, DRSRS working with, let's say, a community group in Amboseli to map out critical habitats for elephants there, and then plan on how to protect them. The question is DRSRS going to protect those habitats? No. You want to empower the communities to protect them. So you must identify from the very beginning that who is going to own and implement the outcome of this process. When the maps are produced and they show us where these things are, the scenarios are developed, then what? So the beauty of the scenario planning is it identifies who, when, and where. Who is going to take charge, where are they going to do it, and when are they going to do it, and probably the budgetary constraints. How much will they need to implement it, and within what timelines? And finally, what are you trying to influence? It's not an academic research where you say, I'm writing a thesis to get a master's degree or a PhD and go home. Here you want to implement a real life-changing project. Whom are you trying to influence? Are you influencing a policymaker? Are you influencing an institution to think differently? Or are you influencing communities to think about the values of the resources? And then who will influence that process? Stakeholder analysis. You want to do it, you are very clear on how you want to do it, but there are obstacles. There are people or external factors that you have to think about. If it's a project that requires authorization, for instance, it's at the government level. You are an institution within the government. You've written your proposal. It's been approved by your director. He needs to take it to another level, and probably up to the highest level. Are you aware of that hierarchy or that process so that your timelines can also coincide with the approval processes? How about funding? Do you feel the funder is happy with what you're trying to do and they will approve it, or they will ask you to change it in different ways? What I've got here, is just an example. Everybody have got their own ways of mapping their stakeholders, but this is the kind of sheet, for instance, that you might use to do that analysis. So you want to know name of an individual, for instance, because even at the institutional level, there are those who call the shots. I've worked in institutions where you have a director who is very nice, accommodating, but there is someone in the system who will always decide what happens. So when you are doing your stakeholder mapping, you have to understand, I'll show you in the next sheet, you have to understand where people sit. If you look at that power dynamics thing, who is the most influential and the most interesting? And of course, you have to think about the scale of influence. To what extent are they going to interfere, or to what extent are they going to support what I'm planning to do? What sector do they come from? Again, we talked about being cross-sectoral. You cannot have people from the same sector and you want to discuss a project that affects different sectors. So you'd want to think about mixing different sectors depending on your objective in a way that can help you do that. Then now you can start your communication and see who is available to come, who is not available, whether there is a replacement and the likes. By that, after doing that, you realize that you've got a rich mix of stakeholders that can easily help you or achieve your objective. So this is a little bit technical as well, but it's pretty simple. How you do your stakeholder mapping. This is a free software online called the Kumu Digitizer. Those who are tech savvy, there's a link at the bottom. If you click on that, it takes you to that software. It helps you to play around with people here. You identify an institution. So let's say, for instance, in the middle, you identify an institution. There's another institution, so all of them are here. Then you start thinking about who here is the most important to me. So it might originate from, let's say, KEFRI here, and you see you have KFS here. So there's already a direct link between KEFRI and KFS. But KFS is perhaps linked directly to the Ministry of Environment. But KEFRI might not have a direct access the way they would want to. So they might think about working with KFS to speak to the minister here. But KFS don't have the adequate evidence to defend that issue, because mostly their work is management, whereas KEFRI does the research. So KEFRI will provide the relevant data and the technical support to KFS to go and influence minister's decision to support the project that they want to implement. So I've already identified a minister, but by virtue of his position, he's not the person who is going to come into my workshop. I've got KFS, who is the manager, because at the end of the project, I would want to ask, who is going to be responsible for the implementation? KEFRI is here, and I know, by virtue of their research capacity, they're able to continuously monitor the performance of that project and even bring in new ideas and new thoughts on how to improve that project within the forest that is managed by KFS. But KFS needs approval from the ministry. Are we clear? So understanding how the players interact, who is influencing who, and who will influence my work is quite critical. So basically, what I have here is simply showing, or rather an example of how the stakeholders were involved in different projects, going through the Kesho Toolkit analysis process, all of them being invited from different sectors. So this was an example that was held somewhere in Kilombero in different areas. There was the district government from Morogoro and Iringa regions, the national government, research institutions listed there, universities, development agencies, private sector, and the civil society organizations. A lot of people came on board. Now, this is a huge number, and that means you really must have a very clear objective of why you brought them on board. They have their own expectations. Why am I here? When I leave this place, what am I taking back to my institution? It's quite important to map all those out and bring them on board. Now we've finished with the mapping and stuff. We know whom we want and the objective, and we are ready to go. So where do we start? So when we now get to the workshop itself is where things are. You are now collecting the actual data that will determine whether you succeed or fail. Number one is basically people are in the hall. We need to really be clear about the expectations, because they just don't appear to come there. Why are they here? What is the expectation at the end of the workshop? So this must be discussed quite clearly, and people should be very open about what they expect at the end of the workshop, because they were sent by their institutions to represent them. They didn't come to just sit with you there. So when they get back, they want to report that I went there for us, this is what we wanted to get. Did we or did we not get? And remember, at the end of it, there will be assignment, or rather signing of responsibilities. Did my institution get some responsibility? Are we going to implement, or are we going to support in a different way? So those need to be clear from the very beginning. As usual, you can use, I don't know how many of you have worked with communities, but we'll be looking at participatory GIS at some point, using different sorts of sticky notes or different things to let people write their expectations and stuff. They can't write them on a board, they can write them anywhere, but what you need is to be very clear. Think about ice breaking. I did talk about participants who are a little bit shy. In every workshop, there are those who will never talk unless you ask them to say something. So you also have to understand the people you are facilitating. But the process of networking, breaking the ice, letting people interact, intermingling in a workshop scenario is quite important, because it makes interactions quite easy. Other questions, why did you decide to take this workshop, is quite important. Links into the expectation, amongst others. And of course, as a facilitator, because when you finish this training, we expect you to run a workshop like this with the communities to collect the data. So being able to walk around the room, you can play some music, you can do, just making sure that people are able to engage with you are part of the ice breaking. Maintaining eye contact, amongst others. Those are skills that you can't be trained, but you learn them as you go along, as you facilitate several workshops. Rules of engagement. You hold a workshop with community members. Different people with different habits, different cultures, different expectations. The power rules. Somebody feels, I'm the chief of this village, why should I sit at the back? I need to sit somewhere here. Some of those rules must be defined. Time management, timekeeping. You have to have these things in place, because if you don't do that, the workshop might not end at the right time. Housekeeping, I think we did do that here yesterday. Where are the toilets? If during COVID we talk about the protocols, have your masks on throughout, do this or don't do that. How do we take photos and videos? Are we happy to have them shared on social media and the likes? So just making sure everybody is comfortable. And of course, this can always be written on a flip chart like that. So in other words, in your budgeting, you think about the materials you need for the workshop. So when you talk about boundaries, we are talking about that entire system. What is included in that system? So we need to get a bit of judgment here. And this is judgment that you will not get from a book that says this is how to define the boundary. It all revolves around your research objective, the location, the area of influence of the driver. If it is within a conservancy, like what Evans is doing in the Mara, is looking at conservancies. So you work within the boundaries of those conservancies. It becomes your boundary for the work. That is the geographical boundary. If it is maybe a district, that becomes your boundary. So just the same way you define study area is what we talk about when we talk about the geographical boundary. So you look at that system of interest is what you are looking at only. Other things might come on board, but they might not influence really how you want to think about that. So some of the elements when it comes to boundary setting are things like the goals. What is the goal of this work? So what constitutes success, for example? Your goal is to see what constitutes success, or why are scenarios being developed? Nature of the data that you require. Is it going to be data from households? Is it going to be geographical data, remotely sensed data, data that is perhaps supposed to be tested in the laboratory? Talk about the extent, that's the spatial extent of your work, which of course we've talked about in terms of the boundary. Talk about the subject, the problem itself, the actor that is involved. Is it about a county government? Is it about a national government? Is it about a protected area? Or is it about a pastoralist community living in a certain area? Or maybe farming community and their interactions with elephants around Amboseli area? And the design. How do you want to get this information? Do you just want to do you want to explore, just to understand, get the information and try to make sense of it? Or do you want to create a story out of it? Or do you want to get deeper and deeper? And then, of course, there are two approaches to it. You can either, forecast, or you can backcast. So the first one is where you start with the present situation, past situation, and asking yourself, why are we here today? And you now work backwards, the backcasting bit. So you try to make sense of why we are here, building on what has happened before. The other one is also where you ask yourself why we are here today and thinking about the future. This one is more or less a repetition of where we started. You already did your analysis of stakeholders, but now you are in the actual workshop. Who is in the room? And I think the director did mention yesterday that it's important to think about the voices that are being heard. Whose voices are contributing here? So you do your registration and find out who is missing that's supposed to be here. Do you invite them in the follow-up workshops or not? Or are you satisfied with the numbers that are already there? Again, these are things that you just do on flip charts during the workshops themselves. You start developing the scenarios, which Yvonne will take us through, basically thinking about whether it is normative. Is it something that is happening normally, and therefore you don't need to dig deeper? It's like, it will rain, and so we are just planning that if it rains, we are in good position not to be swept by floods. Or is it exploratory possibilities? Suppose it rains, what is likely to happen? Or if it doesn't rain, we go into droughts, what is likely to happen? Think about the end users. We talked about whom do you want to influence? So who is the end user of this product? Is it the county government? Is it the farmers themselves? Is it the pastoralists? Is it the NGOs, or who is going to use it? So while you are having your conversations, have the end users in mind, because they are the ones who will be able to target it. Communication tools. How do I package the end result? Is it going to be a policy document? Or is it going to be a project document? Or is it going to be a paper, a video, whatever it is? How do I disseminate this information to these end users? Definitions, we talked about them yesterday, the kind of terminologies we use. At the workshop as well, make sure that your participants understand these terms that we'll be using. Then the trend analysis becomes the next thing. So what this talks about when we talk about the trend analysis is just looking at the historical timelines, what happened and how they did happen and why. We are looking at those drivers in historical times. The reason Kesho does this is because we believe that it is those past events that tend to inform how we use land, and they tend to inform how we think about the future use of land. Talk about climate change, for instance. The droughts that we've talked about, they keep recurring. How do they influence what we are going to do in the future? So some of the things, or some of the critical things that we look at, this is just an example. There are issues that you think about, talking about environmental, technological things, economic issues, political considerations. So you try to break it down to make it easier for your analysis. You look at the social issues. Historically, what social issues have happened in the landscape today? What are some of the social drivers? Things like population dynamics. You see population increasing. Examples we got from Amboseli were like in the 1982 coup, there was a gentleman who ran away, or a few people ran away from being prosecuted, and they went and hid down in the Amboseli area, and they started farming. So they're saying, well, we never had farming going on, but because they came in with an idea, they started small-scale farming, and over time farming grew. And then when the Kikuyu migrated into this area, particularly around Kimana, they brought in the farming culture. And now we have irrigation going on. The Maasais are now becoming farmers. They're they're diversifying into farming from pastoralism. So the social interactions, intermarriages, we talked about those yesterday, are changing the way people view land use. Technology, for instance, farming in the Mara region used to be small scale. But with the introduction of mechanized farming and the wheat farming, it became large scale. So change in technology, we need to know historically, when did the first technological farming arrive in the Mara? How did it expand? And what are we looking at going into the future? Is there an opportunity that it will expand more, or it will diminish? Economic changes, think about national level GDPs, tourism economy for some communities, agricultural economy, pastoralist economy, their contributions in that community and how it has changed over time, environmental issues and the politics. All these things need to play, but the best way to understand them is to break them down into those different components. You don't have to look at all of them because they might not all be at play where you are, or they might not all be things that you are interested in researching, but think about them because we are looking at the socio-ecological systems being complex. The process of working with stakeholders now, this is why we call it participatory. In each of these groups, you do these things on your own. And a number of you, I'm sure, have done some of the work like this with communities for different purposes. It is the same process, except that the kind of data or information we are looking at is different. So like these guys who are trying to develop, rather draw a timeline, especially the last one, you can see that chart with lots of gaps there. You'll see some of those. Trying to draw a timeline, historical timeline of events that have shaped land use, land cover change within their environment. And this is the outcome in terms of now more of a technical outlook of it. So what they do on those flip charts, you now go through the information they gave you, go back into the literature. Some of them are not so sure about the dates or when certain events happened or what they were called. So you now revisit your literature and find out how these things were happening. And in this case, the middle one here becomes the driver that you are talking about. That driver that you are interested in, because we said it becomes the center of action. So in this second one, we are looking at the impacts along the Savo conservation area. And this started from 1898 up to 2016. So this was by Jessica, I believe. Yeah, Jessica and the rest of us, but she's the one who led the process. And what this was aimed at was to find out the historical events around, or rather along the standard gauge railway. Then, of course, most of that goes into the GIS bit of it, where now you provide them with a map. Normally, that geographical map that you already prepared at the beginning, you now share with the participants and you ask them to identify exactly where some of those changes have happened by drawing them. So what do we understand by participatory GIS?
I believe it is a way of coming up with the mapping involving stakeholders.
So this is just about working with communities, helping them also understand. As you also understand, let me use the word territory, where their spheres of influence reach. And in my experience, I can even tell you, if you walk 70 steps from here to there, utakuwa kwa mtu mwingine, maybe another 5, 10 steps like that. And they'll draw that map with precision.
we are all right. It's all about participation, and that's what we've been talking about from yesterday. You don't do it in isolation. You work with people, stakeholders, and it's not just communities. You might also work with experts. There are instances where you call experts working in those locations. They have a lot of knowledge and experience, and you bring them in a room, and you have your maps there, and you work on them. You might go to the communities, like Madam said. They know the boundaries, like they know everything about that community, where everything is, and they'll just draw it on the map for you, and you should be able to get as much as possible. Those sorts of activities on a map, on a topo, how do we call them? Topo sheets. So they're able to, just mark where things are using visual aids, like you've just given the example there, to place. You might ask them, where is the church? They place them on the map where those churches are, and you are able to mark them. Where is the cattle dip? It is here. Where is the forest boundary? And all these things. So working with them to identify some of those examples like this, just identifying where everything is or where disasters have occurred. They might say this is where we used to live, but when the water levels increased, we moved to this level. But 10 years later, water level decreased and we came back here. And people now, because it's gone, we've now stretched this far. So you can easily be able to mark the trends of how they have shifted that might not be available on any of the literature. So you might introduce the group activity. You can use Google Earth satellite image because that might be the latest. And that might be the one that shows exactly where things are, apart from the ArcGIS produced maps. But whichever of them, if you are confident that it's the latest representation, then you are good to go. Talk about dividing them in groups, just like you are running the normal workshop. They now are able to identify some of those places, particularly landscapes that we've talked about, climates and livelihoods. What do they look like? Draw the structures, such as roads, schools and churches, etc., on that map. Land cover classes, we've talked about. Where do they see the croplands? Where do they see the commercial croplands? How have they changed, amongst others? Consider economic activities. They might talk about where the market centers used to be. Either they have shifted or new ones have emerged, and how have they changed across the landscape. Talk about, of course, they have to be nicely labeled. And then from there, you might think about what do they see as the future looking like. So let's talk about expansion of croplands. You might ask a question that now that we can see the boundaries here, what do you think in the next 5 years? Is it going to increase or is it going to decrease, and in which direction? We talk about the direction of that increase. Is it towards the forests or away from the forest? Identifying drivers of change. Now, this is a very critical component of the workshops themselves because it forms the basis of your analysis. Your main goal is to identify the drivers of change that have led to land use land cover change. What might have led to those changes? And how might they have led to those changes? And probably, what were the critical events that occurred that signified those critical land use land cover changes? And I kept on talking about the droughts. I talked about the changes in policy. And I talked about things like immigration or changes in human population. Several of them. Remember, at the end of the day, you are looking at developing the scenarios. And we talked about being open-minded to both the desired or what we want and what we want to avoid, the undesirable. Because if you direct everybody to think about only what we want, then that obscures thinking about what we don't want. Because the purpose of scenarios is to identify both the positives and the negatives. Because at the end of the day, one of the scenarios or two of the scenarios will be what you don't want to see happening. This is what we did yesterday, identifying the drivers of land use change in your areas of operation and how they are happening. So we will build on those drivers that we already identified yesterday to move to the next stage of today's exercise in the afternoon, which is basically now trying to build the narratives around those drivers. Examples, you don't need to go through them, we already discussed them yesterday. Drivers of the past land use change and the drivers of the present land use change. Now, why we look at them differently is that what happened in the past might have happened and it disappeared. Today, a new driver emerges. And in one of the examples I mentioned about the consequences of land use land cover change, remember I talked about the chart. If you remember the chart that I presented there, it had things like agriculture, it had industrialization, it had pastoralism, amongst others. So the one that I think is critical for us that we'll build into Yvonne's presentation is what's called the morpho matrix or the scenario narrative chart. It's basically taking some of those drivers that we've identified, we've ranked them, and we pick the most important ones and create an axis. So basically, it looks like this. So in your process of creating those scenarios, so the SS represent the scenarios. So we've got the scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3, and scenario 4. Each of these will represent different images or different visions of what the communities think about their land use or about their status in that community. And we have got those drivers of change, which is now in that case, we have the factor A, and what does it look like, the description. You describe what it looks like. We'll see an example. And then you've got that factor A, and then factor B on the other axis. So in this case, factor A is increasing, yeah? Factor A is decreasing. Factor B is increasing. Factor B is decreasing, yeah? So what we have here in scenario 1 is where we are saying, under the situation where factor A is increasing and factor B is decreasing, we have a scenario X. So using this example, where we have got a factor where we are looking at conservation is improving, conservation, improved ecosystem services, and climate smart production. So all those things seem to be on the increase, yeah? But on the other side, we are seeing environmental degradation, exploitative production. The mirror opposite of what is happening here is what is happening on the other side. So whereas there we are seeing positivity, here we are seeing negativity. But it is against good land use planning, sustainable market and infrastructure development, good political will. So all these are things that are positive. The flip side of it is now the bad things altogether, which is land use conflict, unsustainable markets, development, political interference.